Hi, everybody, and welcome to Balancing Practice and Industry Work with our lovely guest, Adalya Nash Hussein. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm tuning in from the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and that Adalya is also joining from Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung land. I give my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and to any Indigenous viewers who are tuning in tonight. I want to acknowledge as well the long and rich history of Indigenous storytelling in this country, and my position as a guest, writing and practicing on these lands. So to introduce Adalya Nash Hussein is a writer and editor. Her work has appeared in Meanjin, Overland, VoiceWorks, The Lifted Brow, Ibis House, Going Down Swinging, and others. It has also been shortlisted for the KYD Creative Nonfiction Essay Prize and the Scribe Nonfiction Prize. She has been a CA SRB Emerging Critic, an Emerging Writers Festival Melbourne Recital Centre Writer in Residence, and Wheeler Centre Hot Desk Fellow. She has edited at VoiceWorks, Liminal, and The Lifted Brow, and currently sits as Managing Editor of Australian Poetry and Victorian Writers Centre. I am Brayden Gilmartin. I'm a poet, and I was recently a guest editor for an annual publication for young and or emerging writers published by Australian Poetry Organisation and Cordite Poetry Review, which is called Tell Me Like You Mean It. I published my first poetry collection called Strange Animals last year with No More Poetry Press. And I am this year's poetry workshop facilitator for Toolkits, which is the program that is running this live stream. For those of you who are not familiar with Toolkits, Toolkits Connect is a 12-week program for writers aged 30 and under to develop their skills in a unique and exciting online environment. Toolkits is run by Express Media, and Express has been around for over 30 years, developing, supporting, and promoting young writers through workshops that develop skills, through opportunities for constructive feedback and publication, like VoiceWorks, and through awards and programs that recognize excellence. Toolkits Connect is generously supported by Copyright Cultural Fund. And this session will be available on YouTube as a resource after the fact, and it will be captioned as well in the coming days. Also, if during the session you'd like to ask any questions, you can do that via the live chat section on YouTube. And yeah, we really encourage you to do so if you would like to ask questions. All right. Hi, Adalya. Thank you so much for joining me today.
No, thank you for having me. And sorry, every time I supply a bio, I forget having to listen to it. I'm used to like publications and nobody reads it. And then you sort of this, I was like, oh, I need to pull some of that out. That's too long.
I feel like that's
I'm simply too accomplished. Oh no.
Absolutely a common experience, I think, among writers hearing their bios, like, just no. Yeah, for sure. So I wanted to start with a bit of backstory. How did your relationship with writing and with words first begin?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, my cat's like coming up. She always thinks I'm talking to her. So, yeah, I mean, I've read and written as long as I can remember. It's a bit embarrassing. So I've written something about it where my mum also is a writer. And when I was a kid and I found out, I was really annoyed about it. I was like, no, now everybody's going to think I'm copying you. So, yeah, it's something I've grown up with, always loving. but yeah, I think that I guess there was kind of a pause. I guess there was to me, I could separate in terms of like a period where I really identified as like a writing and reading person, and then a period where I kind of actually became that, if that makes sense. That like for most of my life, I think a lot of people probably, are like, oh, I was very bookish, and I definitely was, and I read a lot, but also I think I sort of saw it as a part of myself identity rather than just as something that you enact, I guess. And then in year 12, I don't know, this is so embarrassing. In year 12, basically, I went on a camp that was focused on being like, science is great. And then at the same time, I had an English teacher who actually like critically engaged with with my writing and didn't just give me like a good mark because I seemed like I wanted it. And it crushed my confidence. And I was like, well, I'm going to do science. And I did.
These important moments.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I wasn't like, I'm never going to write again. I had this idea that I wanted to be a science writer, which is still something that, I find interesting about how we communicate these ideas and respond to these ideas. But yeah, I ended up doing a maths degree. I don't think that was what anybody expected or anticipated, but that was where I ended up. But as I was doing it, I also started doing creative writing classes as like, well, at uni in Melbourne they call it breadth. I can't remember what the like normal person word for other classes. Yeah, so I was doing some creative writing classes. I was getting some good feedback on some of what I've written, and a teacher encouraged me to send it to VoiceWorks, and I did, and they liked it. And that editing process, along with, I'd actually sent it somewhere else first, that it just wasn't a good fit. Like, I don't think that it was, I think they wanted it to be something else. It was sort of more of a lifestyle-y publication, and they wanted it to have a clearer message and be a little bit more saying something that it wasn't really meant to be saying. Anyway, so I think those combined experiences of getting my work published in a place I was really happy with and feeling really like my work had grown through the editing process versus seeing my work having an editing process where I ended up pulling out because I sort of felt like it wasn't quite the right home. Even though like that editor was totally respectful, like they weren't like evilly trying to, manipulate me into changing things. It was just like what they thought.
Was your teacher in high school?
Pardon?
This was your teacher in high school, was it?
No. Sorry, this is in uni when I started writing.
Oh, in uni. Yeah.
No, I think that teacher in high school was right. Like, I think she was right. Like, I needed more time. I wasn't working at it.
Yeah.
I think I'd gotten complacent, and it was good to have time. Like, yes. Anyway, that experience of writing that and having those different experiences of editing really helped me realize that both I wanted to write more, and that was something I still really wanted to pursue, and that I also was really interested in editing. And so I ended up applying, and luckily getting working on the editorial committee of VoiceWorks, which was really helpful, and that kind of, I guess, launched me through the various other places that I've got to edit and write for and be involved in. And yeah, I guess that's kind of the thing. But yeah, I think with the teacher, like, I do think that it was good for me to take, for me, and not for everybody, but for me, I think it was good for me to have a pause from like, this is my whole being, to realizing that even when it wasn't my identity of being a like books and writing person, books and writing was still like a huge part of my life. Like, I think I read way more after I finished high school and was doing science than I had when I was in high school and oriented myself more towards humanities. So
yes. And I think I think it's really interesting you talking about really being interested in maths during that period of time, because I feel like I've always sort of felt that different disciplines, like, there's so much in it for like your practice as a writer, I feel, as well. and that engaging, with like this, with the science and different like biology, and that there's so like, there's so much in that for writers. So it makes sense as well, I think, to be interested in like a really big variety of fields.
Yeah, I think I definitely feel like as like a person, it was the right thing for me to like grow up a bit and like, you know, and I am a writing and books person. That is who I am. But I think to like take some time away from just believing that about myself and actually realize about myself like as an adult. But also like, I think it was great for me as a writer and an editor because I just like know all of this stuff that I wouldn't otherwise know. And I think I really am glad that I did it.
So you are now an editor with Australian Poetry, and you've as mentioned earlier in the introduction, you've edited VoiceWorks, Liminal, Philip DeBrow. So how do you feel your to sort of get into the subject of today's talk, how do you think your work as a sort of industry professional, quote unquote, affects your practice as a writer?
Yeah, there's definitely positive and negatives about it. I think that if I'm purely like recommending a career where it's like writers should do this, I think there's often writers who have this perspective of, well, writing doesn't make money, so I should be an editor. And it's like, oh boy, do I have something to tell you about editors. But it is something I also really love and that I find like creatively like inspires me and also satisfies me, that I think like I think it's a creative process in itself, not in a way where I would like claim ownership over other people's works kind of creativity, but just like thinking about other people's work, I find it really creative. And but it's definitely complicated, and it waxes and wanes. I think that sometimes I find myself really energized by my other work to do my writing work, and sometimes I feel really drained by my other work to do my writing work, or sometimes I feel energized by ideas but drained from energy. So it's a hard balance to strike, definitely. I think it's also like for me personally, I know like someone called me the ultimate freelancer the other day, and I was like, that's like the last thing that I want to be. Freelancing is so stressful. I'm not a person who can, my Australian poetry job is like a certain number of days a week, and I have like contracts for most of my stuff. And I do freelance a bit, but I more just have many unstable employments rather than being a freelancer. But there is a bit more stability in that I know like, oh, I have these 4 issues locked in. I have a contract until this period where I'm paid this amount of money. For me, I need that. Like I know that there's writers who can like week to week like just produce this incredible volume of writing and send it to all these different places. And like I know like Ronnie Scott has given some talk that I heard where he sort of went through how he like made money as a freelancer. Basically, he was like, you know, on Tuesdays I pitched like from this hour to this hour, I said these kinds of things, these kinds of places, and this is how I would like budget and all of that kind of stuff. And I can't do that. That's too stressful. I need to just know like I am going to be okay. So I need to have like a job other than writing to have headspace to write at all. But it's definitely complicated to balance where I do my writing, where I devote my energy to, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So in terms of that, like practically, do you think you kind of have a bit less of a like methodical way of approaching it, or?
Yeah, I try and I think it's sort of like it helps when I have something I know I'm working towards, like a deadline. Definitely helps me make sure that I set aside time for it and just know like, okay, I have to get this done by this date. So I need to find the time. But also I think sometimes, yeah, it is like finding opportunities or like looking at my work schedule and being like, okay, like this month I'm going to press. So I'm really not like, I'm not going to set myself up to be writing something then or beat myself up for not getting any writing done. Whereas like this month I know I have a bit more time. So I'm going to say that, oh, okay, on Wednesdays in this month, I'm just going to go to the library and write. And that's going to be like dedicated writing time, dedicated to my own practice. But it is also just kind of, sometimes just stumbling on it where I have space, just being on the train and having an idea and putting it in my notes app and coming back to it when I have more time to really sit with it.
Yeah, totally. I always find when my like practice is a sort of daily kind of, not necessarily writing every day, but that kind of just like continual engagement with it in those small ways of like writing down notes and that kind of thing. I always feel like I'm in alignment with like how I want it to be or how it works best or something.
I think I've always worked a little bit in fits and bursts, especially because I often write autobiographically. Sometimes it really is like digging a wound. And it's like, I just can't do that every day. It's not really like, for my soul, I need that to be like one weekend where I'm like, and then I'm like, let's.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And
it's like work and writing, Venn diagram.
yes, exactly. So yeah, I think that's for me. But it really depends on what I'm working on. Like that's not the case for everything. For other things, that's like if I try and write it all in one go, I'm like, my head is too full. I can't I don't know what I'm writing.
Yeah, totally. Is there anything that you've, I guess, learned specifically from being an editor that has really impacted your own writing?
I think that editing definitely is a big part of my own personal writing practice, which is not to say like my pieces come in perfectly polished and don't need any editing. Like they get a lot of help from being edited as well. But I think that the way I tend to write, again, especially like more personal stuff and poems and things like that, is quite, I will have two documents and I'll have one where it's like me just like brain to paper kind of thing. Just any idea I have will go in there. And then I have another one where I copy the things that I think are good or where I like understand how they're going to slot together kind of thing. So I'll like pull one bit and move it over and kind of find another bit and sort of move it over. And it's kind of, it's like a structural edit. It's like a copy edit where it's kind of taking this like raw material and editing it into something else. Like I think to me, it's like writing can be a thinking process. Like often when there's something I feel really like, when there's stuff that I'm really upset about, often it's kind of this like, woo, 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 like in my head, and I need to put it down to work out what it is that I'm actually thinking and to feel like I have it kind of honed, I guess, if that makes sense. And so, when I write, like often I'll come back to similar ideas or I'll kind of contradict myself. And so then it's helpful to like see that and then work out, okay, well, how does this slot together? Like what represents what I'm saying? I think I remember, again, with that first piece that I published in VoiceWorks, like so long ago when I was putting it together, like I was trying to work out how bits of it fit together and I was feeling like, oh, this is like not really smooth. And then I realized I could like add a dinkus and I was like, this is the most powerful thing that God has created is like this little, that's like the little like 3 punctuations. It's like section break. And I think, obviously they can be overused, but I think that was really helpful. Like, I think that often when people start writing, they'll try and write something from the start to the end. And some people can do that. Like there are writers who do that, and I'm in awe that you can just go like, and it just comes out in a like linear flow. And for me, it's definitely not that. And it is like a bit of an act of archaeology to put it back together. And I think my archaeology skills are definitely like better for being an editor.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And do you think like having a writing practice and you know, starting off as a writer before getting into editing, how do you think that affects your work as an editor?
Yeah, I mean, I think it affects it in a lot of ways. I think that, well, yeah, for one thing, I'm a lot more reliable as an editor than I am as a writer. Sorry to anybody who is waiting for writing from me. I'm really good at like deadlines and spreadsheets and all of that kind of things as an editor. And as a writer, sometimes I just like, I'm not like my inbox as an editor and my inbox as a writer are two very different places. And I think that means that as an editor, I both have like insight into, you know, the what like writers' temperaments, but also like and you know, empathy and all that. But also, I think I you know, like I'm able to plan with knowledge of that and build in like, okay, well, like where can I work in flexibility for the timeline? Like how can I plan this so that if people need more space, I can give it to them? And how can I communicate this super clearly so that they understand that? How can I try and make people as comfortable as possible? As a writer, I also understand like it's a fact that an editor is intimidating. Like I try really hard not to be. I really think of myself as not wanting, I don't want to fight with a writer. You know, I'm not interested in having a combative relationship with a writer. I'm not interested in being the kind of editor who's sort of striking things through with red pen and, you know, being like, this is terrible, it needs to be like this or whatever. That's not my relationship to what an editor's role is. I think an editor's role is to like ask questions and provide possibilities to help the writer see where they're going. But I mean, to be honest, as an editor, I don't want to take a piece that I feel like I need to fight with someone about, you know, like if it's something I don't see something in, I'm not going to take it. And that's like for the writer as well. Like they don't want me to change. They don't want me to get into a fight with them about how they need to change their work and whatever. So I know for myself that like, well, I'm not interested in I'm not like going to try and force this person to make decisions that they don't like about their work, that like I know how I see my role, but I also know from the other side that it can still feel really like scary, and you still can feel like where am I allowed to push back, like what am I allowed to say no to, but also like how do I trust this person, you know, that like I think being an editor has given me a lot more confidence as a writer to know where I want to place my work and to know that, like, yeah, there are just places I don't want to put my work. And it's not necessarily because I think they're evil or don't like what they do at all, but I'm just like, I just don't like see my work as sitting in that space. Like, you know, I'm not necessarily really interested in working with that person. Not because I think I don't think they're bad. I just don't know that we see eye to eye. And yeah, I think as an editor, it's sort of like you do have to, there are times where I'm definitely treated in a way where what I am saying is like, you're terrible and you need to change everything. And that's not what I mean, but I understand how it can be really overwhelming and intimidating. And so I set myself aside and be like, okay, I know that's not what I meant, but I also understand why a person can feel that way and by this institution and by an editor and by a publication. And you know, I think it helps me sort of, I don't know, be a bit grounded. I think that sometimes editors can be, I think that sometimes writers and editors can have this like combative stereotype of each other, of writers as being like divas and editors as being like tyrants or whatever. And I think it does help for me to know like, yeah, well, like I know I'm not that, but I also understand why people like can feel that way towards you when they haven't had the opportunity to build that trust, you know. I just haven't earned that person's trust yet, and like, you know, I don't begrudge them for not trusting me, you know, like
yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah,
so I don't expect to always have it.
Yes, I think I found in my recent role as a guest editor, just like how much responsibility I think there is with it, like in terms of I guess being in a position where you potentially could hold sort of a position of power over somebody else's, you know, work, and just kind of acknowledging that, I guess, in trying to give, I think I sort of approached it from trying to give the writer as much like autonomy as possible, like, and really just sort of offering like in a kind of like in a way of making suggestions rather than directing or something.
Yeah, and like I think that sometimes when you talk about wanting to give writers autonomy as an editor, it can make it sound like you don't believe in editors. And I really do. Like, I think that, you know, like I love to see how work develops through the editing process. That's why I love to be an editor. But it is that like choice and opting in. Like the thing that excites me the most is when I like ask a question or provide like a small piece of feedback where I'm like I don't know if this is the best example. Like I think that this is kind of maybe contradicting this other point you want to make for this reason. And then instead of kind of just like, subbing it in with a slightly cleaner example or something, it like turns into this like extra layer in the piece of like, well, like how does the ethics of this rub against the ethics of this, and that kind of thing. And I think that can be a really exciting thing where, where like you sort of check something's a typo and they're like, oh, it is, but actually I love it and I want to integrate it in all these other ways to like, it's no longer a typo, even though it was and I'm glad you like showed that to me. It's like, I really believe in how like extra people in the room and extra like feedback and somebody like opening things up in the right way and providing the right like context and feedback can help a work to grow. But I don't necessarily, I see myself as like a facilitator of, you know, like I'm kind of like pointing in directions and they get to choose how hard they take that and where they go. And it's not, it's like a very, does that make sense? So
absolutely. No, I really love the way that you put that. Definitely. And I think from my experience, which is, you know, relatively limited, but like in the position I was in, I was able to sort of like fully kind of I guess direct the editing process in a way that I wanted to. The publishers didn't really really gave me that freedom. So I was very much like, you know, to the writers, like, if you want if you want my feedback, how much of it do you want? What specifically do you sort of like want feedback on? And if you don't want it at all, like, please say so. But everybody did want feedback. And I think like what you were saying before about this sort of like, I don't know, maybe like a stigma in the relationship between writers and editors, but I think that it is this really beautiful relationship and a really important one as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. Well, I wanted to focus a bit specifically on your industry work. So you recently started at Australian Poetry, but you were working for 2 years as VoiceWorks editor. How was the transition between those two roles?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy and hard. I think it's always complicated moving from different publications because, at this stage I have worked for quite a few different literary journals and magazines and things. And so to a certain degree, I feel like I understand the rhythms, but also they're always slightly different. And so I think sometimes you kind of, I think I realized with Australian Poetry that like I didn't have as full understanding of what the whole year's timeline was going to be as I would have for maybe something where I felt less confident in my understanding of how one makes a magazine, but that it was different and like, in a fine way. Like I'm not like, oh, and everything's gone terribly wrong, but it's sort of like I didn't have quite the same understandings of like how things would overlap and layer and like what amount of time this would take versus this amount of thing. Like I think one difference I hadn't really processed at the start was just how many more writers it is in Australian poetry, that like for VoiceWorks, because it's a mixture of non-fiction and fiction and poetry and comics, you're still working with quite a lot, like 30 to 40 per issue, but there's other editors who are also working with them, so you kind of it's a bit split, but it's not quite as many Australian poetry. It's normally closer to 100, which is a lot more people to email. So and then there's also things like differences in level of experience, in age, and in medium. Australian poetry, it's all ages, and I definitely hadn't worked with. I'd mostly worked with like younger writers or people kind of closer to my own age, and it's definitely been something thinking about, like communicating with clarity and just like how do you manage things in a way that everybody's able to interact with, things like forms, things like Excel spreadsheets, not everybody has the same level of computer literacy for that to come naturally, and so that's kind of been like working out how to try and come up with systems that are the most effective, but also creating ways for people who struggle with that kind of thing to still feel included and be able to participate. I think like poets are definitely like a different
breed.
In a great way. Like I say this and then I'm like, all of my best friends are poets. And I don't know if I'm like call myself a poet stage. I write poetry, I write other things. I still don't know if I'm poet brained. But like definitely I think like obviously what I love about poetry and what I love about working with poets is the incredible attention they have. Like I think it really speaks to the same part of my brain that's really
sorry,
like, I love reading.
One moment, Adalya. My heat is making a very strange sound, so I'm going to turn it off.
Okay, that's fine. I'm gonna keep talking and hopefully Brayden doesn't get lit on fire. Okay, cool. So,
I'm so sorry. My heater in my house, when somebody else puts on another heater, it just makes this terrifying sound. And I really couldn't go on with that happening in the background.
Yes, okay, very fair. Yes, but I love proofreading. I love like style guides, em dashes, quotation mark. I get really into it. And I think that speaks to the same thing that a lot of writers find in poetry. I think there's such an attention to detail, such a like particularity of voice, and I guess like intentionality. But poets can also still like make mistakes, and so it can be this complicated thing of communicating like, hey, like this, I don't know if this is intentional. I don't want to say it's bad if it isn't, because I don't think it is, but like just double check. Like, I think this is intentional and I would like it for these reasons if it is, but also if it isn't intentional, this is what it would normally be like, or this is how a style guide, or this is how the Macquarie Dictionary would do it. And it's definitely, it's like with nonfiction and fiction writers, like obviously, you know, there's still things to care about, but like I don't know, very few non-fictional fiction writers care about if you use an M dash or an N dash. They're like, okay. Whereas like poets care about it. Not all of them, but lots of them do. And so you can't like, enough of them care about it that you have to ask, but also enough of them don't care about it that you have to ask. You know, that like you can't just leave them all and be like, yeah, sure, that's what they meant, because like they might not have meant that. But you also can't change them all, because they often do mean that. So yeah, that's definitely like a complication as an editor. I think it's like a much more at a much more detailed level from a very early stage of how you discuss and look at things. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think that's so true, and it really speaks to poetry as a like mode of writing, where because I feel like because the language is so sort of is being played with so much, that things that are like that would like slip by in prose just don't in poetry. And like something like a line break can be extremely important. And yeah, I've definitely had that in the past with like my work being published, and then just like the structuring being off slightly, and me being like, no, absolutely not. It's a different poem.
Yeah, totally. And so yeah, I really want to like honor that intention, and ensure that we're like rendering it how it's intended to be, because also things can just go wrong where like a PDF can be sent where for some reason, like when they saved it as a PDF, the italics just didn't go through and they didn't double check it. And so like you need to like check and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's definitely, but it is like, it's also like the sort of thing that's hard to communicate, where you have to be like, on line 16 of stanza 3, we would style like this. But you know, like so yes, it's a complicated brain. Okay, sorry. Hi.
Oh my god. I'm so glad we have a second guest speaker.
Yes, yeah, she's gonna. We did theme one of the issues of VoiceWorks Pickle, and she's a nepotism literary cat. She's gonna be like, I don't know, like was it who had the dog, that poodle that everybody was it I can't remember her name. Anyway.
I feel like you need to have an author's photo with her, maybe.
Yes. That's my next headshot.
Yeah.
But that's sort of the kind of ways that poetry is different. It's a much more, and poems are just so much more compressed. It is this much more compressed scale. Like you have to read it much more slowly when you're trying to pass it, but also like try to like you have to be unafraid to ask silly questions where you're like, I think that I'm wrong. Like I think that it's how it's meant to be, but I should check just in case, because once I discovered, I wrote an essay, and it was all about how this poetry book that I read had these pages that had like bits that were kind of cut out, and like you had to unfold them. And I was like, oh, it's about like the materiality of the book. Like it's kind of implicating you as a reader, and like engaging you in the process, and making you realize that like how you're interpreting this is like, you know, something that you're like tangibly doing. I just had a misprinted copy. Like nobody else's pages were like that. I got a really good mark. Like, but like that's not like, so yeah, you have to ask. You have to be like, is the page meant to be folded and cut up like this? Because the answer is sometimes no.
Yeah. I love that. So as an editor, what do you think you look for? Maybe specifically in poetry, what do you sort of look for in a poetry submission?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different for every poem, obviously. Like there's no like a good poem. It's not something that you're aiming towards. I think the things that excite me is feeling surprised, I guess. I think that I like when I read something where I don't where there's things that are unexpected about it. I think that can be down to just like an unexpected turn of phrase. Like I think poetry, because it is often such a more compressed form, if it's kind of relying on, cliche is too strong a word, but just like more well-trodden kind of
idea,
ways of phrasing something, you kind of it doesn't like evoke something. Like I think I really need to feel like there's something tangible, there's like a specificity, there's something that's like surprises me as I'm reading it, where I haven't heard it expressed that way before. I haven't imagined that particular texture before. I guess that's definitely that's probably the most general thing that I would say about most of the poems that I love, is that there's something that surprises me, whether it's like a joke. Like I think humor is like the classic form of surprise. I think that but also obviously there's plenty of poems that aren't funny, but funny things can be expected. Like to me, bad humor is where you know exactly what's going to happen next, kind of thing. But yeah, it can also just be down to like the detail of a pairing of two words in a way that I haven't really seen, or that images that I haven't seen paired together, I think is always something that I like. Just like a oddness to a voice, like a kind of angularity or texture that is unusual, I guess. I think I'm always interested in explorations of form. It's not necessarily something that I am like, I only like formal poems. I definitely mostly don't. Most of the poems I like aren't necessarily super formal forms, but I'm always interested when it can be done really badly, but I think when it's done well, it's something I find, interesting to see. Exploration of form and that kind of more strict level is something that I think is really again, I guess it's another kind of surprise of, again, you can see really badly done formal poems. It's not very good. And definitely that would be I would say a lot of the like bad poetry that I read is like formal poems that have been done badly, because it's writers who maybe haven't read a lot of poetry, and who their vision of poetry is this one particular kind of formalism, and they're trying to replicate it without necessarily having a lot of originality of voice, or the kind of being able to hone that particular form. But I am really excited by it still. Like I do still think that
totally,
it's something I'm still drawn to when it's done well.
Yes, I totally agree. Yeah, I think that that sort of engaging with form when there's not really an awareness of its like where it sits maybe in the cultural sort of like literary history, I think is when last week actually in the toolkit stream we looked at playing with form and just the sort of possibilities that can come with breaking the rules of different types of forms and kind of like considering poetic forms as having like a history and them also being political in that way. So what could you do with that as a contemporary writer?
Definitely. I think I'm also really interested in digitality, I guess, is something that I'm always excited to read work that's kind of digitally experimental. I guess like awareness of medium more generally is something, I guess, I think in the same way I'm a punctuation, I'm a bit of like a book freak. I'm like, yes, the paper stock of this is not very good quality. Like I like, book. I have a feeling of what a book, formally, whatever. But I feel the same way about like digital spaces. Like I love really interactive digital writing. Places like Running Dog and Crawl Space and things just make some amazing work. And I've also like produced some kind of digital, like somewhat interactive stuff. And I think to me it's like this. I like. Thank you, Mia.
I love how it says that you have said that.
No, they need me to know. This is on my gravestone. But I think that there's something about an awareness of the space that something sits on. So whether it's a poem, like really having that awareness of like the page that they're on, like the pagination, that kind of thing really I always enjoy. But similarly, like in a digital space, like interactivity, how it's going to sit on the screen, like where it can go to, where it can come from, like how you interact with the screen, how do you move your mouse around, that kind of thing. That's always something I'm really excited by as well. Like, and I think that's another form, like form, like I'm interested in how people respond to the like restrictions, or not necessarily restrictions, but like context that their work is in, I guess. And I think that can be very restrictive by trying to like put these further restrictions, create whatever particular syllabic rhyming schemes and stuff. But it can also just be like more generally like, how does a poem sound when it's spoken versus when it's on the page versus when it's on a screen, and how do you change that however minutely for that different context? It's something I find really interesting as an editor, like for one of the forthcoming publications with Australian poetry that we're working on at the moment. There are a few digital poems that we're pulling into print, and like working with those writers and with the designer to sort of figure out like, okay, how can we best represent this on the page? Like what can be enhanced, not just like, how can we get over the fact that this isn't going to be digital and so it's missing things, but also how can it have new things, what new is brought to it by that different context. I think that's something I find really interesting. So
that's so interesting. I feel like that's almost like a whole other talk or something.
Yes.
As someone who works as an editor and a writer as well, what kind of advice do you give to young writers, like trying to publish their work?
I mean, I guess I have a few pieces of writing. I mean, I think like if they're watching this, like already great start. Like I think Express and VoiceWorks in Australia are such incredible resources for young writers, and there's so many emerging writers who are no longer in the right demographic who I know are like it's so sad that they're not able to access. I think a piece of advice I guess I would give to all writers is like read. I think that sometimes, I don't know, I know other people have different perspectives on this and I don't want to be a hater, but like I know sometimes people can be like, oh, like I don't like having other people's voices in my head, but to me it's like the more voices you have in your head, the easier it is to recognize where the context yours is sitting in. Like I think so often you see young writers like pitching or writing something where it's just kind of clear they don't have a context for what it is that they've produced and kind of how it is replicating other things that exist, or maybe like seems a bit strange for not having acknowledged this really big, obvious piece of writing with similar themes. So not that like everybody has to have read everything and I'm like, how dare you not have read this particular essay on this subject already? But I think sometimes it can really stand out where you're like, especially with voice works, you often would get pieces of people sort of pitching like, I've got this idea and nobody's ever had it before. and it's, you know, and it's always like, it's done with a good heart and good intent. And it's like, you know, very young people, and I don't want to like be like, there's silly people who don't realize, but you know, but as an editor, I'm like, well, people have written about this before. And so if you want to write about this and if I'm going to read your take on this, I need to see how you're differentiating yourself from that, well, where you're different from that person. Because I think every writer does have their own individual voice and something different to say. But I think sometimes it takes also understanding what has already been said to understand how you veer against that. You know, that like if you don't realize, oh, yeah, this person said something very similar, but I actually like, but what I'm trying to say is different. And so I know I need to go further to explain how it's different, because to somebody who isn't in my head, they don't necessarily see that. So yeah, I guess those are reading, voice works. Those are probably my biggest pieces of advice, I guess. Yeah, I think like, in terms of working with editors, I think, yeah, it's a complicated thing of, you know, simultaneously like not being too scared, I guess, to send your work anywhere at all, but also being willing to, like, know when it's not the right fit. I think can be really hard. I don't necessarily know that I have a good piece of advice for that, because I think it's so dependent on the situation. You know, there are going to be some editors who it's just like not the right piece for them, and you don't want to work with them. That's not the right place for that piece for you. But also there's going to be, you know, but also I think it can be scary when it's not actually. So I don't know, hard to say.
Yeah. I think that, and I think that really links to what you said before about engaging with other people's writing, because I think, knowing the kind of writing that a publication will commonly publish, I think that is that's such an important thing to know.
Yeah, definitely. I often get, you know, people sort of ask like, how, you know, I think that there's this like piece of advice that gets given that can sometimes seem condescending, where editors say, read the publication before you send your work there. And I think it can sound like rude, because it can kind of sound like it's a like, you know, you have to engage with us for us to think that your writing is good or something like that. But it's like, you know, it's a good piece of advice, because like, what if it's not a place you want your writing to be? You know, that like completely aside from like whatever political differences, like whatever else, that like there could be a great piece of romance writing and a great anthology about like grief, and they could both be really good and like really high quality, but like the really great anthology about grief is not going to want to publish the romance piece. And if they did publish the romance piece, a reader would read it and be reading all these pieces about grief, and then suddenly read this like erotic piece of writing they're not expecting, and then going back to the piece about grief. It's not the best context for your work, you know, like it's not setting your work up to be received in the way that it's intended or to be read by the right readers. And so yeah, I do think like familiarizing yourselves with the places that you're sending your work, not because otherwise like your work is bad and the editors, you know, we're not giving you our time if you don't give us your time kind of thing, but just because it like it might not be the right fit. And then you're getting rejections needlessly and being like, why didn't Grief or Sadness want my 50 Shades of Grey thing? And it's like, it's not about the 50 Shades of Grey. It's about,
it might be about the 50 Shades of Grey.
Yeah, you know, like it's about the specific place you sent it to just not being the right home for that, for like completely non-quality based reasons.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess that's my piece of advice, maybe.
Yeah. Great advice. Well, I think that's about it. So thanks so much for everybody for tuning in, for those of you who have. And thanks so much to Adalya for joining me. Again, and I do encourage you to check out her work. A reminder that this session is also on YouTube, will be on YouTube as a resource, and it will be captioned in the coming days. And you can join us tomorrow. And I will be sitting down with Kiara Lindsay, discussing slippery poetics, moving between the real and the unreal. Very excited for that one as well. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks so much. Bye.